Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that hits close to home for all of us. The U.S. national debt.
Yeah, the national debt, it's one of those things you hear about all the time, but do we really understand it?
Well, that's what we're here to find out right
Yeah.
now. We're going to dig into some official U.S. Treasury data and explanations and see if we can't make sense of it all.
Sounds good to me.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll know exactly what the national debt is, how it works, and how it affects you.
It's not just some scary number looming over us. There's a lot more to it than that.
Right, like it's not just one giant credit card bill the government's racked up, is it?
Not quite. It's more like, think about your own personal finances. You've got your mortgage, your car loan, maybe some credit card debt.
Oh, so the government has like a whole mix of borrowing going on.
Exactly. They use these things called marketable securities, which are basically like bonds, bills, notes. Think of them as loans that investors can buy and sell.
Okay, so kind of like how companies issue stock, but instead it's the government issuing IOUs.
You got it. And then there's this other category called non-marketable securities. These are a bit more specialized, but we don't need to get lost in the weeds there.
So it's like a whole financial ecosystem. But didn't I read somewhere that the government also owes money to itself?
Yeah, that's what's called intergovernmental debt. Basically, the government moves money between its own accounts. A big chunk of it's owed to the Social Security Trust Fund, actually.
I always found that a little strange. Like borrowing from yourself, how does that even work?
It's a bit of a head-scratcher, I know.
Oh, boy.
But trust me, it's a big part of the whole picture.
Got it. Two main types of debt. Stuff we owe to outsiders and stuff we owe to ourselves internally. Okay, that makes sense. But here's a fun fact that blew my mind. The U.S. has been in debt since the very beginning, since day one.
You think about it. The American Revolution wasn't cheap.
Oh, yeah? They had to pay for all those muskets and cannons somehow, right?
Right. That war racked up something like $75 million in debt back in the 1770s.
Wow. And where did they even get the money back then?
Mostly from domestic investors and, drumroll please,
No.
French government.
The French. Our good old allies. Always coming through at a pinch.
It seems like whenever there's a major event, a war, an economic crisis, or even a pandemic, the national debt jumps up.
Yeah, you've got the Civil War, World War I, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the 2008 recession, the COVID-19 pandemic.
It's not just some made-up number. It really reflects the challenges our nation's faced over the years.
Okay, so it's a story of our history etched in, well, debt. Makes you think, huh. But let's get down to brass tacks here. How does this whole debt thing actually work? Does the government just have a giant credit card they swipe whenever they need cash?
Huh. I wish it were that simple. Basically, when the government spends more than it takes in through taxes, that's kind of deficit.
Like when I blow my budget on online shopping.
Pretty much. And those deficits, they add up over time and become debt. And to cover those deficits, the government borrows money. They do it by selling those treasury securities we talked about earlier.
So it's like issuing IOUs to investors worldwide.
Precisely. Those investors get a guaranteed return in the form of interest payments.
So they're kind of like lending money to the government.
Exactly. It's seen as a super safe investment because, well, the U.S. has never defaulted on its debt.
That makes sense. So it's like a giant global savings account, but for investors who want to park their money somewhere safe and earn a little interest.
You got it. And all those interest payments, those add up over time, too. That's where the debt really starts to accumulate.
I see. The government borrows to cover deficits, investors get their interest payments, and the cycle keeps on spinning. Okay, I'm following so far. But why should the average person, like me or you, actually care about the national debt? How does it impact our lives?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
Because let's be real, it can feel like this big abstract thing, right? Like something politicians argue about, but doesn't really affect us day to day.
You'd be surprised. All that borrowed money funds things we all care about. Healthcare, education, defense, scientific research.
So it's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's the stuff that makes our society tick.
Precisely. But, as you might imagine, a high national debt can have consequences.
Okay, like what?
Well, it can lead to higher interest rates, which make it more expensive for everyone to borrow money.
So things like buying a house or starting a business could get a lot tougher.
Exactly. Plus, there's this whole other beast we need to talk about, the debt ceiling.
Oh yeah, the debt ceiling. That's like hitting your credit card limit, right?
In a nutshell, yes. It's the legal limit on how much the government can borrow.
And who sets that limit?
Congress does. And when we get close to hitting it, they have to agree to raise it, which often turns into a political battle.
So it's not just about the money, it's about politics too. Figures.
The good news is the U.S. has never actually defaulted on its debt, but even the possibility of that happening can cause major problems.
Okay, so we've got this massive debt that's tied to our history, affects our daily lives, and has this whole political drama surrounding it.
It's a lot to unpack for sure, but I think we're off to a good start.
Definitely. We've covered how it works, why it matters, and even hinted at the dangers of that looming debt ceiling.
We've laid the foundation, and now it's time to dig deeper into the implications and potential solutions.
Can't wait. We'll be right back after a quick break to explore even more about the U.S. national debt. Stay with us.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the U.S. national debt.
We're back and ready to unravel some more of this financial mystery. Last time we talked about how the debt works, its historical roots, and even that whole debt ceiling drama.
It's definitely a complex topic, but super important to understand because it really affects all of us.
Absolutely. But before we go any further, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned. The U.S. has never actually defaulted on its debt. That's got to be a good thing, right?
Oh, it definitely is. I mean, it shows how stable and reliable the U.S. economy is. Investors around the world see U.S. Treasury securities as a safe bet.
So it's like a trust thing. Like even a hint of a broken promise could cause chaos.
Exactly. Even the possibility of defaulting during those debt ceiling debates can shake up the global markets.
Okay, so it's like a reputation thing too. Makes sense.
Ah.
So we've got how it works, why it matters, and how risky that debt ceiling is. But now I want to get visual for a second.
Visual? Okay, I'm intrigued.
So I was on the Treasury website, and they have this amazing graphic that shows just how much money we're talking about here. Because let's face it, $1 trillion is hard to even imagine.
Trying to wrap your head around numbers that big is like trying to imagine the size of the universe. Just impossible.
Right. So picture this. A giant stack of $1 bills. If you stack them up to represent $1 trillion, it would reach like 68,000 miles high.
Whoa, that's taller than the Earth. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah, and to make it even crazier, if you laid those dollar bills end to end, they'd stretch to the moon and back over 14 times.
Oh, wow, that's insane. It really shows how massive the national debt is.
Totally. And that's just $1 trillion. The actual debt is way over 30 trillion.
That really.
Right.
It's mind-boggling. But it highlights why it's so important to get a handle on this thing.
Exactly. We need to know how it's managed and what it all means for the economy and for us.
You're right. And it's not just a static number. It's always changing based on all sorts of factors.
Oh, that's right. It's not like a giant lump sum that never moves. Speaking of change, when I was looking at the source material, one thing that stood out to me was the breakdown of the debt. Remember those two main categories, debt held by the public and intergovernmental debt?
Yeah, those are the big ones. And understanding the difference between them is crucial.
Absolutely. And what I found interesting was they've been growing it at different rates lately, especially the debt held by the public. I'm guessing the COVID-19 pandemic really messed things up there.
Oh, definitely. I mean, think about all the stimulus checks, the rising healthcare costs, the economic turmoil. All of that led to a surge in government spending, which pushed up the debt held by the public.
So that's the debt we owe to everyday people, businesses, and even other countries who bought those Treasury securities, right?
Exactly. It's like the government borrowing money from the whole world to keep things going. And then you've got intragovernmental debt, which is basically borrowing from one part of the government to fund another, like an internal money shuffle.
So like moving money between your checking and savings accounts to cover different bills.
Right. But remember, a big chunk of that intergovernmental debt is owed to the Social Security Trust Fund.
Right. So the government's basically borrowing from Social Security. How does that even work?
It's supposed to make sure Social Security stays afloat in the long term. When Social Security takes in more money than it pays out, they invest the surplus in, you guessed it, U.S. Treasury securities.
Wait, so the government is borrowing from Social Security to pay for other things. That seems a little iffy.
It does raise some eyebrows, and it definitely adds to the overall debt.
Okay, I'm starting to get how it all fits together, but it makes me wonder, is this system even sustainable in the long run? What happens when those surplus funds run out?
That is the million-dollar question. It's at the heart of the whole debate around the national debt and Social Security's future.
Right. I mean, you got the aging population, rising healthcare costs, slower economic growth, It's putting pressure on everything.
It really is a financial tightrope walk. Maintaining that balance is a huge challenge.
So what can we actually do about it? Is there a way to reduce the debt without making drastic cuts or raising taxes like crazy?
Well, that's what we're going to dig into next. Stay tuned.
And we're back for the final stretch of our deep dive into the U.S. national debt.
We've explored the history, the mechanics, the challenges, and now the big question is, what can we do about it?
Exactly. We've learned that this isn't just some abstract economic thing. It's woven into all our lives. So what are the options? Is there a magic solution out there somewhere?
If only it were that easy. Think of the national debt like a huge ship. It takes time to turn it around. No quick fixes here. We're talking long-term strategy.
So no magic wand, but maybe a good map and compass. I like the strategic approach. But where do we even begin with something this big?
Well, we've got three main levers we can adjust: government spending, tax revenue, and economic growth. The trick is finding the right balance.
That sounds delicate. Like cut spending too much, you hurt essential services, raise taxes too high, and you risk stalling the economy.
You hit the nail on the head. Each lever has its own pluses and minuses, and it'll probably take a mix of all three to get it right.
Okay, let's break it down then. First up, spending cuts. I know this is a sensitive topic, but are there areas where the government could trim the fat without causing too much disruption?
That's the million-dollar question. And this is where politics gets really messy. You've got things like defense spending, subsidies for certain industries, administrative costs within government agencies. But each one's a whole can of worms.
Yeah, I can see how that would get tricky fast. Cutting defense is always controversial, and messing with subsidies could look like the government's picking winners and losers.
Exactly. That's why just focusing on spending cuts isn't seen as the answer. It's just one piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so what about raising taxes? Could that be a better way to go?
Raising taxes can definitely bring in more money to tackle the debt, but it's not without downsides. Sometimes higher taxes can discourage investment and slow down the economy. Plus, they're not exactly popular.
Seems like every option has a trade-off. No free lunch in the debt reduction game, huh?
That's the challenge. It's all about finding that balance, that sweet spot where we make progress without causing a whole bunch of unintended consequences. It takes a lot of analysis and open discussion.
All right, last lever. Economic growth. How does a booming economy help us shrink this mountain of debt?
When the economy's doing well, businesses grow, people earn more, and that means more tax revenue for the government. It's a win-win that helps lower the debt-to-GDP ratio, even if the total debt stays high.
So it's like making the pie bigger so the debt slice looks smaller in comparison.
That's a great way to put it. But remember, economic growth isn't a guaranteed solution. It can be unpredictable and take a while to have a real impact on the debt.
So no quick fixes, just a lot of hard work and careful planning. No wonder this is such a complicated issue.
Complicated, yes, but not impossible to tackle. And it's important to remember this isn't just about numbers and economic theories. It's about people, the services they need, the future we're all building.
You're right. It's about real lives and real impact. So as we wrap up our deep dive, what's the one thing we want listeners to take away from all this?
The biggest takeaway is this. The national debt is a complex issue with no easy answers. But it touches all of us, and we need to be part of the conversation in a thoughtful, constructive way. It's about understanding different viewpoints, weighing the consequences of our choices, and working together to find solutions that benefit everyone.
I love that. It's not about blame. It's about collaboration and finding common ground.
Exactly. And remember, this goes beyond dollars and cents. It's about our values, what we prioritize, what kind of society we want, investing in education, building infrastructure, creating a strong safety net. Those are the real questions behind the debt debate.
Wow, so it's really a conversation about who we are as a nation. Well, I've definitely learned a lot from this deep dive. We've gone from feeling overwhelmed by the debt to understanding the nuances and even some possible ways forward.
That's great to hear. Knowledge is power, and understanding this issue empowers all of us to have more informed discussions and make choices that shape a better future.
Absolutely. To everyone listening, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep the conversation going. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the U.S. national debt. Thanks for joining us.